Chief Information Security Officers traditionally held as their primary responsibility protection of sensitive data within an organization's IT infrastructure. CISOs generally report to CIOs in both business and government. As security threats expand to include IoT, UAVs, supply chain, and more, many large enterprises in public and private sectors are evolving the CISO model to a more expanded role. This plenary executive roundtable features experts who will share different perspectives on governance models for today's complex global security threat matrix. Moderating the roundtable is EDGE22 co-chair and vice president and chief security officer for Avangrid, Brian Harrell. Mr. Harrell will be joined by Michael T. Dent, Chief Information Security Officer, Fairfax County, Virginia; Stephen McAndrews, Deputy Chief Information Officer, National Nuclear Safety Administration; Yemi Oshanaya, Chief Information Officer, Transportation Security Administration; Mark Redlinsky, Chief Information Security Officer, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission; Mark Weatherford, Chief Information Security Officer, Alert Enterprise.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone has a cup of coffee. You see that we changed our living room just a little bit. This is all in anticipation of getting some feedback and some good questions from you all. So let me just prime the pump, so to speak, real quick, and I'm going to come back over here to the panel. But today we're really talking about convergence. And frankly, this is nothing novel. We've been talking about this for the last 15 years. However, I guarantee you there's a number of organizations in this room right now that have said, you know what, convergence isn't for me. I would much rather have the blind spots that I have. And so today what we're going to talk about a little bit is just this idea of IT, OT, physical security, and dare I also add a little bit of emergency management to the convergence paradigm as well. So again, nothing novel, but today I think with the threat landscape being as blended as it is, rarely do we see a cyber-only attack or a physical-only attack. There are operational imperatives, there are operational impacts to every single attack that we are seeing. And so to not have that full situation awareness, that full visibility into the threat landscape potentially puts you at risk. So we're going to talk about policy, we're going to talk about examples, we're going to talk about organizational structure, and frankly, why hasn't industry fully embraced this like maybe others have? So more to come. Get your questions ready. It's hard to see up here, I'll be honest. However, so if I see you kind of flag me down, throw a question our way. I want to engage you. I have about 10 questions. I know we will not get to them all because I have 15 minutes to do all of this, but I think we want to engage you with some good questions. So here we go. All right, so I guess the first question, I'm going to turn it over to Mark from FERC. Maybe take off the regulatory hat or keep it on, I don't know. But from a regulatory perspective, has the government and the utility sector, and I guess I count myself as the utility sector, have we responded to the pressures of convergence? Are you seeing it within FERC OEIS, within NERC SIP? Is this where we're going as an industry?
Sure. First off, thank you very much. Very happy to be a part of this panel. I think Brian is the perfect moderator, especially for this question. I am the regulator, unfortunately, and there's been a ton of shade thrown at regulators over the past, 2 days. But I'm here to help. So we're going to speak. I'm going to speak specifically for the bulk electric system here and talk about kind of OT-IT convergence. First off, I want to set the table for everyone. I was at a panel yesterday listening, and the gentleman asked a question with the Zero Trust Architecture panel, and he said at the end of the thing, can somebody ask or tell me what Zero Trust Architecture was? And I thought that was a great question, so I want to set and just frame what our question or our talk would be about for the bulk electric system. So when I talk operational technology, I think we all know what the IT is, but the operational technology would be things like industrial control systems, SCADA systems, programmable logic controllers, PLCs, DPCs, essentially things that take an input and From that input, it had pre-programmed outputs. Typically, they could be mechanical. They could be turn off this gyro. They can be flip that circuit breaker, slow down that turbine so it doesn't overspin, okay? And why do people want it? I think Brian made a great point. Everybody wants it, right? Because efficiencies in process, better data collection, more automation. A great example would be, a hydropower project in Maine that can basically open up floodgates or close floodgates while sitting on your couch based on the weather forecast, right? Do it kind of from your phone. That's a pretty big picture example, but I think it's germane. So now I'm going to kind of identify, I think, what we see as the big problems within the IT-OT convergence within the bulk electric system. I'm going to illustrate it using some of our favorite attack vectors that we've all been talking about all week. So the first off, and I'm really glad that TSA spoke earlier, was about the colonial, right? And essentially, the OT system wasn't affected, but the IT system was. There was a malicious actor on the IT sector, and we just shut everything down. Colonial just shut everything down just because we don't know necessarily where we are connected, right? And that's not a great place to start, especially with the bulk electric system. You can't just turn off the grid. And that's really what I'm talking about with the bulk electric system. We're talking major generators, major transmission lines. You can't just turn that off and then turn that back on. There are balancing issues, there are load issues, not really easy to do. So that's one issue. Where are we actually connected? Number two is the diverse set of problems that hooking up IT, which moves at the pace of Moore's Law, right, doubling computing power every 2 years, and the OT sector, especially in the power world, which is where we're dealing with some legacy systems, especially, let's say, on your traditional baseload or dispatchable generation types. When you bring those two things together, I think we saw with Log4j, right, which looks like it could have affected the intermittent wiper of a Ford Pinto from 1974 kind of thing. Do we really know what an IT and OT convergence looks like? Decade-old IT exploits could then actually hurt your OT on the system. And finally, I'm not really sure there's such thing as an air-gapped system anymore. We saw this with SolarWinds, right? You're going to have to patch things. You're going to have to change system patches, config files on all your different ICS devices. You're going to have to hook something to that. And if it's from a trusted vendor, I'm not really sure if that's actually air-gapped. So that's the problems. How are we mitigating it currently? SIP standards. Brian talked about it. SIP standards, and I think SIP standards, I believe, within the critical infrastructure sector is the gold standard for how we do it. We've heard a lot of people talk SIP standards, and I think that's fantastic. And the idea of public-private partnership, the way SIP standards work, critical infrastructure protection standards, there's 13 of them currently. They're set by, or they're created by a group called NERC, which is part of the Federal Power Act, Section 215, sets them as the Electric Reliability Organization for the United States. It's made up of industry, essentially. It's made up of a board of governors that get together and they put together these basic critical infrastructure protection standards. They send them up to FERC as the government regulatory body, and we say, ominous dominus, we like it, or change this, and it's a back and forth, but it starts with industry, and I think that's really important. But the speed at which we do SIP standards don't necessarily rely or translate well to a new, 0-day, whatever the case may be, threat that comes out in the cyber world. So, but slow can be good sometimes, right? Slow's good in the sense that when we look at SIP standards, this is the basics. This is the building code that everybody should. You walk in here, you know that outlets are going to be 12 inches off the floor. You're going to have smoke detectors in each one of your occupiable rooms. Those types of things. That's how I think we should look at SIP standards, is the baseline. Set the basics. And like I said, slow is good. Provide assurances. We can short circuit. Sean Kaufman was saying the other day that he was looking at the latest DoD authorization bill to see what was going to affect his at Discover, right? SIP, I think, kind of short circuits that when it makes the process a little bit slower. It's industry inputted throughout it. How do we make it better? Well, industry-led, government regulatory approved, I think, is the way to move forward. I just kind of spoke through that. I like to call it regulation through cooperation. And how do we do that? I think we advise and consent versus audit all the time. There has to be buy-in from private industry that you will sign up for these SIP standards that you potentially help make. But I love the idea of downgrading information in tear lines as a way to kind of share information out to our regulated industries. Tear lines, tear lines, tear lines. You don't care, and for people that are not in the national security world, tear lines are basically You remove the most sensitive stuff out of intelligence reporting so you can send the information that matters to the people that need to see it. I don't even care that a telemetry device was the thing that actually grabbed this piece of data at the SCI level, right? I don't, as a consumer and as an SCI holder, I don't even care about that. You certainly don't care about that as a regulated industry. You want to know what the problems potentially are. And I think finally, well, two last points here. I think government needs to be organized properly and use the right tool at the right time. The assistant director from the FBI talked about regulatory bodies asking for information that the FBI is willing to share, or that they've shared with the FBI. I think that's crazy, right? The regulatory process works in that you're the building inspector that sets the fire code initially. You shouldn't be asking for those things as a regulatory body. And we should also be organized better, right? Across the hodgepodge of agencies that does energy, big DOE, big DHS, FBI, CSER, CISA, FERC, NERC, TSA, PHMSA, right? I mean, it's all over the board, and Avangrid doesn't have the time to respond to 16 different people while they're trying to take care of one thing or another. We need to do better at being a single touch point. And my final point is you have to talk resiliency and recovery, and I heard this yesterday in some of the panels. You have to talk resiliency and recovery if you want to really talk about kind of keeping OT, IT in the box that allows us to turn the lights on, because we're not going to protect against everything.
So I think a rising tide does in fact lift all boats. I think some compliance is good, but I think, Mark, and we go back to our NERC days when we worked there, let's not have compliance and SIP standards hold industry back, right? Technology is moving way too fast. And the moment you kind of go through this checkbox mentality and you put handcuffs on everyone, so to speak, the entire industry, the entire sector is unable to move forward. And I think we saw this in the migration of the cloud so many years ago, right? We're better today. We kind of got through some of those hurdles, but certainly an issue. I think it needs to be performance-based rather than this kind of check in the box. I have a unique opportunity where I am the moderator while my mentor is on this particular panel. And so Mark Weatherford, a dear friend of mine. So Mark, I want to say thank you, number one. You have helped me in my career and some of the things that I've done tremendously, so thank you. And number two, you have long talked about this idea of IT, OT, physical security convergence and the need for it within industry. 85,000 foot to you. How are we doing on this journey?
So do you want some sparks?
Yeah, let's do it.
Because
be provocative.
I disagree that slow is good, and to the reasons that you just said. And I want to expand this. I mean, you're right on with respect to energy and the bulk electric system, but convergence is much bigger. I mean, we have customers in retail, banking and finance, healthcare, water, everywhere. But I think to the point you made, Brian, one of the struggles that we had in developing the SIP standards, and by the way, as you know, Mark, it's a multi-year effort to push out SIP standards. Well, if you're responding to certain threats and vulnerabilities, guess what? The things I'm worried about 12 months from now are not the things I'm worried about today. So these SIP standards are reactive, and they're not, as Brian said, they're not performance-based for the most part. There is a, check the box to make sure that you've done X, Y, or Z, which may or not reflect reality. So I just wanted to say that. So it's funny, when Brian first asked me to do this, I have been talking about convergence for years. And I went back in my treasure chest of notes and presentations, and I gave a talk in 2009 and talked about security convergence and how we needed to be bringing IT, OT, and physical security together. And this is where we see a lot of impetus today across many of the other sectors, not just critical infrastructure sectors, but I said like retail and some of these other verticals, that they are finding the need to blend the physical security technologies within their organizations, the gates, the badges, the cameras and things like that, blend that into their IT infrastructure so they can figure out, okay, is a person who has a badge to get in a certain place, but is he caught on camera in a place where they may not supposed to be? So there's an incredible amount of physical and convergence and blending with IT. when I was at DHS in 2011, I actually started a little initiative. I put a couple of people, and I said, hey, we really need to start thinking about this convergence at DHS from CISA's perspective. Actually, this was pre-CISA, but start thinking about this because, you know, this is going to be a big deal one day. And then in 2000, actually last year, 2021, CISA actually wrote a report and a paper on IT/OT physical security convergence that miraculously, it literally could have been a white paper for Alert Enterprise. We could have put our name on the top of it and our name everywhere in it. It said exactly everything that we say in every one of our documents. So that was validation to us that we're on the right track from a recognizing that convergence is important perspective. And one of the other things I looked at is in 2015, Alert Enterprise wrote this little book called IT/OT Security Convergence, which again is kind of prescient that we were able to, back then, 6-7 years ago, now thinking about this, a topic that's really become du jour for today. So, to your question, how are we doing? I think if we were in a room of all government people and we talked about security convergence, you could throw a rock out there and not hit anyone that really understood what convergence is all about. In the critical infrastructure arenas, however, though, it really has become a hot topic for a lot of reasons. I mean, and I'm sure we'll get into this during our discussion, but you know, the economic rationale for converging security is just, it's profound. The cost savings have made all the difference for a lot of companies when they look at why does it make sense to have a physical security organization and an OT security organization and an IT security organization and have 3 different reporting chains, 3 different silos of security in my company when there's an incredible amount of overlap and blending, certainly a blending of intelligence information that can occur when you converge these organizations. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question. I do think that in the critical infrastructure arenas, we're seeing an incredible amount. I mean, you can't ignore it any longer. Boards of directors are now saying, why are we doing it? Why is the chief security officer, who's typically responsible for physical security, why is he not reporting to the board of directors and the CISO is? And you know, as my CISO or my CEO, Jasper Gill, as he often says, it's like when you have an incident like this, the security organization needs to know, do we send somebody with a laptop, with a gun, or with a wrench? And unless your security organizations are truly converged, you oftentimes don't know the answer to that question.
Open up to the larger panel here as well, just your thoughts on the journey. How are we doing? I will just add this bit of an anecdote. I've been at my current position for the last 2 years or so, and convergence was foreign. They couldn't even spell the word when I first got there. But now, right after I first got there, we stood up what's called the DUB, or the Daily Update Brief. Every single morning at 9 a.m., IT security, cyber security, OT security, physical security, insider threat, intelligence, and fire protection all get onto the same phone call. Sometimes that call lasts 5 minutes, sometimes that call lasts 25 minutes. But for that period of time, we're talking about what happened in the last 24 hours and what do we anticipate in the next 24 hours. Everyone is on the same page. Everyone is hearing from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I will tell you, at first, it was like pulling teeth. Nobody wanted to share information. Nobody wanted to talk about all the great and wonderful things that they're doing because they were concerned about, well, if I step outside the silo, maybe somebody else who's trying to build a kingdom is going to take some of our key, talking points. We've knocked some of that down now, but it has been painful. And I wonder if there's any other examples while we're talking about this journey question.
Well, there's a lot of pain still in the county because we still have those silos. But the business side of it is now there is a new security manager role that does physical security, but we're kind of tied together almost all the time because anything that gets affected or happens within the county that has a door breach, something goes wrong in one of the buildings, It instantly goes back to the security camera network, all these things that we've helped them implement and get in, and then it becomes an issue or a concern for me from the cyber side of, did they access anything? Did they do anything outside of that? So then we're pulling logs, we're doing all that. They look at the cameras, they look at the badging system, but they don't look at any of the data that's associated with it. That comes back to us, and then we have to help them parse that out. Mm-hmm. I would love to see the convergence of physical security and IT security come together, especially in our county, because everything they do now, it relies on IT in order for it to work. So you have to have some sort of convergence with it. But right now, emergency management is where physical security lies. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm in the cyber or the IT shop. So,
Mark, I just want you may remember this when we were at NERC. This is just an example, but we were at NERC and we got a report that at a utility, a remote substation, like on the side of a mountain, kind of a substation had been broken into. Somebody had this was back during the copper theft days. I mean, we'd go out and people would be ripping copper out of substations. So there was an alarm and that the fence was down. They went out. The doors to the substation itself were still secured, so they just assumed that everything was fine, that we just stole copper. I think it was like 2 or 3 months later, there were some weird things happening. They went out, they actually went inside this remote substation, and they found that somebody had actually been in there and been goobering around with the PLCs. But the lack of communications between the physical security guys and the OT security guys left this gap in for 2 or 3 months, I think it was, where again it just kind of validates that being able to communicate between these multiple siloed security organizations is really critical.
Yemi from TSA. Post-colonial, has the TSA taken cyber and physical security principles into account as they reveal some of these compliance initiatives that you guys have going?
Yeah, we're in the middle of that right now, and you guys are all spot on. I think even just the mere fact that we're sitting here saying the word convergence, that's part of the problem, right? We think separately. We try to manage the people in the organization as part of Conway's law, as opposed to looking at what we're trying to protect. And so that's the avenue we're taking now. What is our objective? What are we trying to protect? Because the threat actors don't look at it the way we look. They're not separating things out. They have the objective and the target, and they go for it. If we think that way, like you spot on with Colonial Pipeline, it was what folks didn't know that had operational shutdown, right? So if we're looking at preventing operational shutdown, it's physical and it's digital. And it doesn't really matter what level of OT you have, it's all becoming digital. I mean, you look at, we met with an airline, the funny thing they said is when they added a router to a plane, that changed our entire paradigm. You add a router to a crane that lifts like some 1,000-ton engine, it changes the way you think because your access points are different. I'll take it even a step further. We protect these physical assets, and these buildings are built in a way that you protect things from the ground. Now we have drones. I mean, we got drones that can lift a person up to the top of a building far easier than we could before. So your understanding of what you're securing has changed. So you need to take 2 steps back, have a robust conversation, and figure out what's the objective of what you're trying to protect, what's the objective of the industry, because they see things different than we do. We got to meet with some airlines, and it's fascinating how, from a TSA perspective, we're protecting transportation, goods, passengers, and services. And from a business perspective, they're protecting the asset and what they need to deliver from a profit perspective. So, operational shutdown for an airline is a plane not taking off. But so we need to bring those two concepts together and have one way of approaching that. And that comes with understanding. That's going to come with, I know we had a conversation yesterday on one of the panels that Sean was on. We talked about, CIO, CISO, should they be together? Let's take it a step further. You have the mission side of the house that needs to understand cyber so that when we speak the same language, we understand what's going on. Bob Costello from CISO, he and I spoke yesterday, and I asked him, I said, what do you think about IT? Should IT be just inside the CIO's office? Should other people be able to deliver and support IT? And we kind of sat there and he said, it's got to be democratized because there's no way in the world that you're going to have a CIO control every piece of technology that exists within the organization, outside the organization. You got to empower people, have the same objectives, and come together, because the landscape is far, far too large, and the attack surface is too large and diverse. So,
I think there's 1,000 different ways to write up an organizational chart, right? And so I often tell my staff, I don't need to own everything, but I do need to have 100% visibility of everything.
Yep.
And minus that, you're kind of flying blind, because typically if there's a breach, it's not necessarily the CIO that's going to stand before the board potentially to get fired. It is the CSO who needs to be armed with that ammunition and the information that they need to smartly tell a story.
I got your back.
Thank you.
Well, I guess to stay on the post-colonial theme, and I know there's a lot of opinions on there, and I have my own, but has TSA, maybe be a little provocative here, has the TSA done a good enough job of engaging industry as they create these security directives surrounding cyber for pipeline, for railroads, et cetera?
So I'll give you an answer that's probably double-sided, right? I'm going to say yes, but you can never do a good enough job because it's evolving. So the first thing we did is we had a conversation. The conversation resulted in a directive, and Austin talked about it this morning, which was a little too prescriptive, and so we came back, and now it's objective-based. That's probably not going to be the final straw, right? Because you have the companies, and then you have the companies in the supply chain, which some of them are small. And had the opportunity of being in a small business, if you have 40 people working for you, your IT closet is probably the kitchen. So how do you secure that based on NIST standards and ISO 27001? How do you do that? Do I lock the kitchen? Do I put a box? So you have to figure out how to have an expanded conversation. And where is really the weakness? Is it really the pipeline company? Is it the delivery company? Is it the person that comes and checks the OT? So I think the conversation, the best thing that we've done so far is I've been at TSA for about 8 weeks, and I've talked to already about 4 to 5 large organizations. I've already talked to fields, and I still don't know where all the bathrooms are. So that shows you we're in the right direction, because the conversation is robust, and we're going to keep having it.
With all due respect to my brother Yemi, I would say no. I would say that, but I think it is a symptom of the bigger cause, which is the disarray of which government is organized in terms of protecting or regulating infrastructure, the critical infrastructure standards or sectors, excuse me. And I wish that the congressman was still here. I think that is something that Congress could help with, right? For the Natural Gas Act, FERC, we oversee siting, construction, putting it in service, right? And then all of that all of a sudden gets turned over to TSA because it transports stuff. Like, that literally is why gas pipelines and PHMSA, though, does safety behind it. So I think that's a symptom of, I think the out of the gate gas pipeline regulations that came out of TSA, I think we're too focused on IT things, not understanding the impact on OT things, and that is why I think there's quite a bit of teeth gnashing over it. So I would just disagree.
Mark?
So I agree. But at the same time, TSA had to do something.
Sure.
So I get that, and I agree 100%. But I thought at the time, and I was advocating, with legislator that I talked to, now's our opportunity to open this up a little bit, and don't look at pipelines, don't look just at electricity, look at the entire critical infrastructure of the United States. Now's our opportunity to say, okay, we need to get serious about security regulations and standards for all critical infrastructure. Today, the electricity industry is still the only industry that has mandatory standards for cybersecurity. So that was where I think we really missed an opportunity there to say, okay, of course, understanding the glacial pace that the legislature operates at, I know that it couldn't happen that quickly anyway. But man, I still don't think we are serious enough. Back to maybe your first question, I don't think we're serious enough as a nation yet of addressing cybersecurity across all critical infrastructures.
Yeah, I think in fairness to TSA, I think I was part of those early conversations, and Brian, this is where we're thinking about going. And I say, okay, well, great, but recognize, at least from our industry perspective, we are regulated 3 ways to Sunday.
Yes.
Many of the same organizations that you already mentioned. Let's not be redundant. I don't want DHS CFATs coming to my door on Monday, TSA coming on Tuesday, and then on down the line. That would be difficult. It really would. I am not going to get off this stage until I get at least one question from the audience, so be prepared for that. But Stephen, I want to turn it to you real quick from NNSA. Is more policy needed to better encourage situation awareness? And how does the NNSA, excuse me, big difference there, approach cyber convergence in such a high risk, high consequence industry?
Okay, first, just out of, respect for my last job, which was only 5 months ago, I was the Director of Federal Cybersecurity at OMB, so it was my team that wrote most of those recent policies, so I have to say those policies are fantastic. Spot on.
You support the President of the United States, guys.
One bit. But do we need more policy? The question is, we need to be able to make sure that we fix the problems that we have. We know what we have, but we also know that there's more to come. We know, as Steve said in the last presentation, that S-bombs are still on the, coming out shortly. So there's more guidance coming out from OMB, and CISA is putting out more guidance every day. Sorry, Bob. But yeah, I think that we really need to make sure that we step back and evaluate what we have. To that point, I would say, looking around at all these executives, this isn't like being in the Army again. You don't need a regulation for every single thing. I don't need a book to tell me how to make my bed in this job. But what we need to be able to do is step back and say, what does your agency need? You need to have the flexibility to implement the proper securities. So we just need to be able to do that. Now, as far as the other one, let me first step back and say, what is NNSA? The National Nuclear Security Administration. It is probably the largest organization in the federal government that you all have never heard of. But you all should, because we do 4 major things. We maintain the nuclear stockpile. We work diligently on nuclear non-proliferation. I always get that I always screw that up. And then we work with Navy nuclear propulsion. So all those ships out there that have nuclear reactors, that's my organization. And then lastly, the national labs. We have 3 national labs that work very closely with industry and other organizations in the federal government to develop some really cutting edge technology. A lot of the things that you have seen come out in recent years, from your Apple iPhones to numerous other cutting edge technologies, have come from the national labs. So what are we doing to solve this problem? Well, right now we're diving into it. As I said, I'm recently new to this organization, so one of our main priorities is focusing on OT. It is a huge obstacle to tackle. So we have not only IT, OT, we have production facilities that build nuclear weapons. We have the national labs that do cutting edge research and development. So we need to make sure that we have basically the opportunities to have those flexibilities depending on, that runs the gamut of OT, and making sure that we have that visibility. And of course now going across the entire country to make sure that we can cover all those labs, plants, and sites. So currently we're running an exercise, we're planning to run an exercise in another month or so with some really great industry partners to make sure that we're doing the right things, testing it, making sure that we're rolling out the right policies and procedures, implementing the right solutions to ensure that we're really having that visibility. I think that's the one thing that we're really concerned about, is making sure we have the proper visibility. We have technology that is 20 years old. We're going back to old pins that we're putting on the network. We're putting cutting edge technology, and it's all out there. We have to make sure that we know exactly what we have first, and then coming up with how we're going to address those vulnerabilities.
Stephen, I guess as you're talking, I'm thinking great initiatives, awesome movement forward. You're taking the football down the field for sure. Do you have the personnel and the subject matter expertise within your organization to do all of those things?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we're doing is we're not taking it from just an IT or an OT. We're not looking at it from a CIO or CISO's lens. We're looking at it from the mission's perspective. So we're also looking at, okay, if that pipe, that valve, that pump turns off. When you're talking, and again, no offense to any of my brethren and sisters in the government, but when you talk about no-fail missions, nuclear security really doesn't get more grave than that. So we can't fail. So when we're really looking at, personnel, workforce, we're doing a lot to hire right now, which we are doing a lot to hire. So if you have some great cybersecurity personnel, please go to USA Jobs and have them apply. But also
9 months later, you might have a job.
9 years later, yeah, they might have a job. But no, we are working with, but one of the great things is we do work very closely with industry. Yeah. All of our labs are usually ran by M&Os or maintainers and operators, contractors that run these labs. So we get to bring their cutting edge, and their ability to have flexibilities to hire to make sure that we're adequately staffed.
Yeah. No panel is complete without the state and local perspective. So, have local governments seen successes as they add access control and cameras and identity management systems to their IT infrastructure? Has IT been a willing partner with physical, and has physical been a willing partner with IT at the local level?
Yeah, so as I stated before, I mean, I'm connected at the hip with the physical security manager that we have now. He's come from industry, been through everything. Looking at what we have, and you look at all of our critical infrastructure, elections, our wastewater treatment facilities. So all those things, they are critical to the success and things that go on in the nation and in Fairfax County. So making sure that we put them in, we do, I guess, old school IT of we segment those things off. And I mean, we have a strict policy of there's no remote access. And everybody gets that and they understand that. Of course, the business doesn't like it because they have to pay a little more for the vendor to come on site to do their maintenance and updates. So, but it works and it's doing what it should do. We actually built, the IT department built the SOC for the physical security folks. It's separate from the IT SOC, but it's in a different location, but it's all something that we help maintain. And so you can't be successful in state and local if you're not going to be cooperating, if you're not going to work together with them.
I want to do a plug on SOCs, Security Operations Centers. If you're ever looking to do a field trip and you get the invite from Mr. Adam Lee over here, he has the world-class SOC in the United States of America. Right there, absolutely, take a look. Millions spent, but spent wisely. Adam, very well done. How does technology help or hurt this industry movement? Mark, maybe I'll start with you. Obviously, we don't want technology to be the weak spot or the weak link, the enemy avenue of approach to get into some of these systems. Yet it can also be a game changer, a business enabler. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're not going to accomplish convergence the way it needs to be accomplished without technology. I mean, we still see far too many companies that we go into that are still doing things very manually. A lot of spreadsheets, a lot of pencils and erasers to do things that technology solved a long time ago. So I think technology allows us to be more efficient, it allows us to save money, it allows us to really have better security, more automated security. When you try to do things manually, you lose the efficiencies of automation. Now, and I agree with you. I mean, you don't want to become completely dependent upon automation, on technology, where you can't step back and do something. We've seen this a number of times, especially in the electricity industry, where we've automated things to the point where when something breaks, we don't know how to keep the lights on. We don't know how to keep generators running. So I don't think, we just need to keep that in mind as we're using technology to move further and further down the road.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think that's exactly right. I think there needs to be, across the different sectors of critical infrastructure, I think there needs to be an understanding of where your OT is versus where your IT is. I made that example for the bulk electric system and the difference between, Log4j and what it could do to an old gyro that sits on some system somewhere, right? Versus, let's say, physical access control systems, which have kind of stayed up with the modernization of IT. So I think it's specific to each one of the sectors, but you're absolutely right. There's got to be some understanding amongst IT and OT and where everybody at is in their modernization.
You may remember a couple of years ago, I think it was Andy Bachman and Tim Roxy wrote a paper that said every utility needs to have backup procedures that allow them to turn wrenches and push relays manually rather than depend on automation. I think there are some utilities that are actually building that into their strategic planning now. Okay, if we lost the ability, we lost all of our automation capabilities, can we keep the lights on?
Yeah. Well, that goes to any kind of business, like even with anything that has IT. If your disaster recovery and your continuity of operations doesn't include paper, pencils, because one day these things aren't going to work, something's going to happen.
But
you've got to be
as well as I do. Most people, you look at disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning, very few of the ones, and I've looked at a lot of them, very few of them have that capability built into them. Yeah. They don't talk about, pencils and paper and
well, when we do our exercises with it, because it's an annual review that we do on those plans, they have to include that in there because our leadership's very aware that, if the power grid goes down, what's that going to do to the business? How are the citizens going to expect to get services and do the things?
It's funny to some degree. I mean, we're talking about ourselves here, but let's think 40 years ahead. Those people don't know how to use pencils and paper. so really, how do we start looking at things and not IT and OT? And I know critical infrastructure, because it's large, there's OT. But I mean, if you look across the globe, OT is sliding its way into IT. We won't be saying OT anymore,
right?
Except for your really, really, really big things, right? So I mean, we have to think that recovery could be to another digital product. Maybe it's anchored to something else. Maybe, look at fuel cells and batteries. Look at the Tesla.
Yeah.
Exactly. We do have to keep up with business and digital agility because it's moving fast. There are hydro-powered cars now. We got solar. We got portable solar that can power towns. That technology is going so fast that unfortunately, when people use it for nefarious reasons, we get scared, and it's unfortunate that we can't have in areas remote access when in some areas that's all you do because you don't have power lines running. Let's talk about sub-Saharan Africa. Everything is radio technology because you can't run lines.
Right.
So we need to find a balance so that we can keep moving forward and then be secure at the same time.
I think Mark said it earlier really poignantly about the redundancy and the resiliency. You have to, I think we're all on the same page here. You have to build that. But it also goes back to workforce as well. It's really making sure that you're training for what you have to do and then the inevitable if it fails.
Yeah,
right?
Every other year we do what's called the grid security exercise. Not to get all energy nerdy on you guys at all, but every other year we do this big exercise. And part of the challenge for my organization, and I kind of coined the phrase, how do we operate like it's 1994? We have to be able to go back and operate manually like that, if nothing else, just to create an island of electricity, and then we start reconnecting all of these islands slowly so that we can come back to homeostasis. We'll figure out compliance, we'll figure out billing, we'll figure out everything else out kind of after the fact, but we have to come back to some sort of normalcy. The police stations, the hospitals, they're depending on this. So I agree 100%. I'm wondering if maybe the audience has an opinion on this. Please throw some things our way. But I do wonder from an insider threat perspective, is this the ultimate convergence anecdote or reason why convergence is important? Because I think it's insider threat that touches on everything. It touches on data loss prevention. It touches on active assailant or active shooter. It touches on who's looking at what on my IT systems that could lead potentially to violence, to gambling, to pornography, et cetera, which could introduce threats into my system. So as we as an industry or industries continue to embrace insider threat, is this the ammunition needed for the ability to embrace convergence?
I would say
I think
so.
I asked the question, Austin from TSA earlier, the question about the insider threats at airports. And, it doesn't take a huge imagination to think of, you have all of your restaurant vendors, your Starbucks, think about walking through an airport, all these vendors, and every one of them have a badge to blow through the checkpoints. It doesn't take a leap of imagination to see how somebody working at the coffee vendor could escalate those privileges or simply follow somebody through a door and get access to some place where they could do some serious damage. I mean, they could have a serious impact on airport operations, getting into the wrong place and doing the wrong thing. So I agree 100% with that, Brian.
You're going where I was going. I'll take it a step further. I mean, you have the folks that work in that airport environment, using that example, do not have the highest understanding of technology.
Absolutely.
So you can carry something nefarious like a Trojan horse and you won't know it on a device, on a phone, and come into the airport Wi-Fi, which is public, and you can wreak havoc. And you can move laterally anywhere you want. And so that's one of those things that you have to look at.
Speaking purely from an insider threat perspective, think about people, you got baggage handlers loading stuff on airplanes. How hard would it be to compromise one of these people and have them load something that might go boom on an airplane, or drugs or whatever it might be? I mean, these kind of insider threats are real, and they can have, I think, profound impact on, and airports is one example. Look at retail operations. We've seen this specific use case, so it makes sense, but we had a person who had access to inventory management, but he also he had access to the inventory management system, so he's able to steal things, but then go back to the inventory management system and adjust the inventory so it never looked like anything was ever even there. So he had access to the IT system and access to the physical system, but there was no convergence of the technologies that allowed somebody to go, wow, this same person is doing things that it shouldn't be doing.
We've had some success in modernizing our physical access control systems and our video systems to, gate certain times when people badge or what turnstiles they're coming through at what time if they're opening the garage. And then PTZ cameras being able to turn and look at those things and kind of understand patterns of behavior. So certainly, there are certainly efficiencies that make a lot of sense, and then hopefully lead to things like cost savings where, okay, do I need that many more guards on, if I can dispatch somebody based on a hit that our camera puts on that, was supplied through the badge swipe. I think that's really what we're looking for, and that helps for an insider.
Yeah. So we're fortunate enough to have a question from the audience. Thank you for not making me out as a paper tiger. Thank you so much. Please.
Gentlemen, first I want to thank you for having this conversation, because I think it's so important to have shared ideology and terminology in convergence, right? Coming from the DoD, convergence is something very different for us. Convergence is the convergence of warfighting domains, right? And so in this case, in the cyber fight, IT and OT is definitely a convergence that we all should be aware of. Arguably, going back to some comments that were made earlier by Mr. Ryan about firmware security and supply chain risk management, arguably the greatest thing about zero trust architecture is the use of the word trust to describe cybersecurity, because it forces all of us to consider the role of trust in cybersecurity and in physical security, for that matter. In this system of trust relationships, are we paying sufficient attention to the root of trust for IT and OT, which is found in the firmware?
All right, to the larger panel.
Well, first I could jump in and say that, you look at the executive order that led to, the zero trust policy. It does not mince words when it says it is applicable to both IT and OT. So everything that comes out of that should be held with that lens. So, absolutely. And I know that there's further, as I said earlier, there's further guidance coming along for SBOMs and supply chain. So I think it's going to be a really exciting time for us to have that policy that will drive us to have this conversation. So we can have conversations about that in this room all day long, but until it helps us go to our mission side or our business side and say, look, this is something that's important. It's not just important to us because because of SolarWinds or what have you, but really because this is an administration priority and it's just the right thing to do. So I think brokering that conversation with the business side is going to be absolutely critical.
I think also with the manufacturers, so when you look at OT as it becomes more digital, it's the thought process of enabling the systems to trust or have certain cyber technology to make it secure isn't always the first thought. And so you're finding yourself having to re-engineer that in. Some of the vendors have to have responsibility in making that.
Okay, so we talked about regulation earlier. You said it. There's all kinds of regulations with the underwriters' laboratories. Why isn't IT held to the same type of standard that the electricity people
Because
are?
you have software, and software, you can't hold vendors responsible
But to
for
me,
the
I would
vulnerabilities in
think
software.
we need some way to be able to validate
rhetorical,
these
by the
systems.
way.
I mean, because if the business units were left to purchase the IT stuff, we would be in so much trouble when it comes to OT.
But in some places they are.
And then again, that comes back to reporting. Are they reporting those issues? Are they taking care of that, trying to get it fixed? And they're not. I looked the presidential directive for breach notification. That was a waste of paper. There's no penalty.
Okay, you're right.
The state of Virginia did it. They wanted 24 hours breach notification. In 24 hours, I might not even know what's going on.
Sure.
So they moved it to 48 hours. And then they directed us, one, we had a problem reporting it to the CIO because nobody trusts Vita. I hate to say that. But, so then they moved it, we were going to now report it to the regional intel centers, who are sparsely manned for cyber. They have, I know in Northern Virginia, we have one cyber analyst in that intel center. And trying to report a breach that early, that fast, I'm all about reporting breach because you need it to be able to mitigate and help other people. But the rules and the laws that come out, but no one wants to regulate the software industry of this is how you should be building your products.
I think you're spot on because you're talking about breach and you mentioned Log4j. The breach is a funny word for me because, I mean, you got IOCs that are in your environment for what, years or 2 years, and all of a sudden you see it and you call it a breach. They got everything they wanted.
Yes.
So it's how do you make sure that, to your point, that the vendors have to do something.
Yes.
Before it gets
and be accountable.
And be accountable. Yep.
So with just a few more minutes, I'd like to just kind of go around the table quickly, just kind of give our view of the world. Are we going down the right road, and is there light at the end of this tunnel? And if there is, will we know what success even looks like? So I guess this kind of goes back to the journey question, right? Are we moving in the right direction? Does more policy, does more regulation need to happen? I think the vendor community dialogue and conversation was spot on. Yep. I think vendors are a part of the solution, and oftentimes we say, whoa, vendors, you're not allowed in this conversation because you might get a list of you might get a distribution list with all my people, and you might try to sell them something. Well, when something happens and things go bump in the night, the first or second phone call is likely that vendor, and they need to understand what your architecture looks like. They need to understand what the current dialogue at the national security level is actually saying about indicators of compromise. And short of them being a part of that conversation, you're going to spend hours bringing them up to speed. So they really need to be a part of the conversation. So I'll start with Mark. Are we going down the right direction? Are we going the right direction? And will we even know what success looks like?
So I'm going to take it a completely different direction than you would ever anticipate. I have long thought, and we've talked about it at a high level in a couple of the previous sessions today, I've long thought that we are more tactically focused rather than strategically focused around security. And I think the ultimate strategic focus is globally. That there are no global norms for cyber behavior. Why do certain countries harbor and allow activities that the rest of the world consider criminal? And I don't have a good answer for it. I mean, I've been part of a number of these global meetings with nations to try to agree what is a criminal act, what is not a criminal act, even what is a cyber act. But I think we really need to globally have an understanding and agreement on what is good and what is bad. Because we're not going to be able to combat bad guys when we know, and we always know that, you know, there's going to be a few outliers. Russia and China right now obviously are doing things that that the rest of the world considers abhorrent. But, you know, the fact that in Russia you have criminal activity that's taking place right under the nose of the government is sanctioning it, whether, you know, directly or indirectly, and we're just responding to it, you know, and the fact that 15, 20 years ago, a threat like from Russia or China would be solely the responsibility of the federal government, of the intelligence community of the federal government, or DOD. Today, it's every small, medium-sized business in the country faces the same threat as a Fortune 10 or a Fortune 100 with a lot less resources. And so I think globally, we need to have norms of behavior that say, you know, if you cross a line, and there needs to be red lines. If you cross a line, something bad is going to happen to you. And I don't mean, I'm not talking about kinetic activity, but, you know, there needs to be world response, global response to those kinds of things. And we're just not there yet.
Stephen, thoughts?
I'm just going to keep it very simple and say you are an absolute fool if you believe that you are ever secure. There is never going to be that gold stamp, your mission accomplished banner. It's never going to happen. If you think that that is the case, then you really need to look at a different career field. Because as we get more secure, honestly...
You're hiring, right?
We are, so come on over, I'll help educate you, it's fine. But no, as our enemies and our adversaries change, you know, as we get more secure, they're going to change their TTPs. That's what happens every single time, whether it's a kinetic war or it's a cyber war. So it's always going to happen. So as more we adapt, we get better, we're going to have to change. We're going to be sitting here 5 years from now talking about the new zero trust. It's going to be called something else. We're still going to be moving down that journey. The journey never ends.
Michael?
For me, I guess it's probably going to be workforce, because it's very hard to recruit and to hire at the local level, because all you big guys up here, you have more money than we do, but...
You don't want to ask someone for money?
No. But, you know, trying to make sure what we're doing in our schools, it was said earlier today, I mean, we're not teaching our kids enough about what technology is and what it means to them and their futures, and then trying to champion getting them to be a part of the solutions that we need now and in the future. So I'm hoping that we get something to change from the educational side and get these younger folks more interested in government.
These folks are right about ready to yell at us, but Mark, your thoughts?
I would say we're doing it with one hand behind our back. I think we need, especially in light of the Supreme Court and the major questions doctrines with the EPA in West Virginia, I think the federal government, in order to enable it, needs clear guidance from Congress on what we can and cannot do, and I think that will kind of unshackle us and help be the good partner for an industry that we need to be.
Yemen?
I'll say turn up on strategy, a little more collaboration, because just hearing each other here, we're doing a lot of the things that each other does. Sometimes we don't know what each other's doing, and we have an adversary that knows exactly what they want. So we got to be a little smarter.
Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed being in the living room and talking about convergence. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you, sir.